So we're going to be talking about adaptation in agriculture, and the reason is the agriculture sector is the largest sector that is climate sensitive, and because of that, learning how to make that sector more resilient is going to be terribly important. It's especially important in the low latitudes. Okay, so what adjustments can farmers do? The idea is that the idea we presented before, that you want to try to maximize the net benefits of adaptation. When you think about it from a farmer's perspective, what the farmer's interested in is maximizing net revenue given the land that they've got. So what you're thinking about is what changes can a farmer make that increase net revenue? And that's the decision, that's the objective that the farmer's after. So why is this important? Because the initial analyses of this was more focused on what you could do about yields. And although yields is probably an important component of trying to figure out how to maximize net revenue, the reason why net revenue is different from yields is you're taking into account not just how yields change, which will affect your gross revenue, what you can sell, but you're also interested in knowing how much it's going to cost you. Costs are also a big part of this. So if you come up with plans that increase yields but increase costs by more than they increase yields, then the farmer's just not going to do it, and it turns out it's not even a good idea. So the objective in this is trying to figure out what kind of changes can farmers make that will increase their net revenue given the climate they actually tend to face. So there's the climate today, there's the climate tomorrow. What can they do tomorrow that will help them increase their net revenues? One of the questions that we want to ask is, can markets help facilitate that? Is in fact markets going to be good at getting adaptation to happen in the agricultural sector? Or are they going to mess up terribly? And then what policies should the government be involved in? What role should the government play in the agriculture sector in particular? So there are a lot of choices that farmers make in trying to figure out what they should be doing. So there's a fundamental choice. Am I going to be a crop farmer? Am I going to have lots of livestock? Or am I going to do a little bit of combination of those things? That's a fundamental choice they've got to make. But then once they've made that choice, there are more specific choices they've got to make. Which crop are they going to grow? Which livestock should they focus on in that particular place where they live? What about timing? Should they adjust the planting? Should they adjust the harvest? When you adjust planting and harvesting, you're adjusting your season length. What should they do in that department? And then the question is, what should they do with other inputs? Obvious ones: fertilizer, labor, capital, irrigation, water. These are all things that farmers do as part of their decisions about what's optimal for them right now. One of the things we have found is that all of these decisions are climate sensitive. So as climate changes, these choices change. They're all a function of climate. And that's something we've recently found. So you sort of say, well, this must be known since the time of Newton. This is stuff that's been known since the 2000. This is not stuff that we've known for a long time. We're gradually learning this. But one of the things that is interesting is these are all adaptations. And they're all going to be climate adaptations. That's one of the things that we've learned. So one way you can do this is you can go up to farmers with a survey and you ask, how do you adapt to climate change? So what do we mean by climate change? Well, climate change is sort of how the weather has changed over a 30-year period. One 30-year period versus the next 30-year period. You can ask farmers how they have adapted to the change in climate from the 1950s to the climate we have today. Well, it turns out that's a very difficult question. Why is that a difficult question? Because they were doing something very different in the 1950s than they're doing today. Technical change, huge amounts of change in agriculture all around the world actually is dwarfing the change in climate. We've had a tiny little change in climate, about a ½ degree change in warming. How big is a ½ degree change? Well, the difference between nighttime and daytime temperatures is usually 10 to 20 degrees. So how much is a ½ degree change? It's tiny. And you ask, well, what have they done differently to adjust to that climate change over a 50-year period? That's an extremely difficult thing for a farmer to answer. In fact, most of the farmers have only lived in the current, that only farmed in the current climate. They didn't even experience earlier climates. But even the ones that did, that they've been farming for over 30 years. Can they remember what they did a long time ago? When they were maybe growing a different crop, a different variety, different options for how to actually manage that resource. There's all these things that have changed. Climate's just been a tiny piece of it. So this is one way you can get information. You can go up to a farmer, you can just ask them how they've adapted in the past. But in fact, that's a very difficult experiment. It's a very hard question for them to answer. Then you can say, well, we could ask them about the future. We could say, okay, we're expecting it to be 2 degrees, maybe 4 degrees warmer in 50 years. How would you adapt to that? Well, they have not necessarily thought about that. They don't have any experience adapting to climate. They have a lot of experience with weather, how some years are good, some years are bad, some years have extreme events. They know a lot about that, but they don't actually know much about climate. And when we've asked them about climate, farmers from all over the world, every single one of them has experienced climate change. That is, if you ask them, have you experienced climate change? They say, yes, I know all about it. But then you say, well, what happened? Well, it got warmer and it got drier. But when you actually look at weather data, it may not have done that. The farmer's ability to see long-run changes appears to be very bad. The farmer's ability to see what was last year's weather, excellent. They know exactly what happened last year. So they're very informed about recent weather, but badly informed about climate. And they don't have any experience adjusting to climate change. So just going outright and just sort of asking them turns out to be a difficult way to learn. So I guess you can tell I'm not too enthusiastic about that technique, in case you were thinking of doing it. So what else can you do? You can ask them how they've adapted to extreme events. That they can answer, because farmers have experienced that. They've experienced droughts, they've experienced floods, they've experienced typhoons. They've seen these things, and they can tell you exactly what they did when these things happened. So that is something you can do, and that's something the anthropology literature is full of. To follow after disasters, ask people how did they cope with that, what did they do to adjust to it. We do have a lot of information about that. So what else can you do? Another thing you can do is you can build a model of a farm, of how do farmers make a particular decision, and then you can say, well, what would maximize their profits? And then if I change their climate, well, how would they make a different decision given that some crops will grow badly and some will grow better in this new climate? So that is another way to do this, which involves a lot of very sophisticated modeling, not just of how crops grow, but also how farmers change their choices. It turns out we've gone a little bit in that direction. We've studied how crops change with climate, but we've not studied how farmers would change. So that's something that's missing. So what else can we do? What we've done a lot of is examined how farmers behave in different climates. That is, we've looked at farmers who happen to face different climates because they live in different places. And we've looked at how their choices are different depending on where they are. That's not climate change, that's climate. But what it shows you is that farmers in different parts of the world are actually doing very different things depending on the climate they're actually in. So in Asia, one of the things I discovered is if you go to Mongolia, farmers are not growing a whole lot of crops. They're primarily doing livestock. Why? Because that's a very cold and dry climate. It's pretty hard to grow crops there. It's perfect for animals. So they have made that adaptation already. You ask, well, what would happen to Mongolia if it got warmer? Well, you'd go to a place that is warmer and say, well, what do you people do in this warmer place? Well, if it's very dry, they still don't grow crops. They might grow different livestock. But if it's wet, it turns out they shift to crops. So by looking at different places, you can anticipate how, if your climate changed and looked like that new place, what you would probably be doing when it changes. So that is where we've done most of our research, is looking at farmers in different climates, but within the same place, that is within the same continent or the same country. So what have we found out by doing that? Well, we found out that crops and livestock prefer different climate zones. You knew that anyway, because you know that if you look at a picture of Asia and where crops are grown in different parts of Asia, not everybody's growing the same thing. Turns out not most, but one of the reasons you're seeing a different thing being grown in different places is the climate. Now, that's not usually, historically, that has not been part of economic models. We've not done a good job of capturing climate as part of the decision-making calculus. But it's quite clear that if you go across space and you say, well, why are those people growing wheat, and those people over there are growing corn, and those people over there are growing rice, it turns out climate is a huge reason why it's different in different places. And what that's telling you is farmers are already adapting. They're adapting to the climate they live in, and they know what's best to do in that climate. So one of the things we're assuming is, given that farmers know what's best to do in particular climates, as climate changes, they will change with it. They will learn to do the things that other people have learned to do in the new climate. And that's one of our primary tools for studying climate change, is to see how people have already adapted, and then to see, well, as this place changes, what will it then do in the future? So what are we finding? We're finding things like wetter climates support crops, drier climates support livestock more, so that livestock crop choice is going to change depending on how precipitation changes. What else do we know? We found that, surprisingly, smaller farms tend to be more adaptive to climate change, less sensitive to climate change than larger farms. And what are larger farms? Larger farms are bigger commercial-sized farms. It turns out what we've found in general is larger farms have specialized in crops that give very high returns if the climate is just what it is. And often they're specialized specifically in temperate zones. So if you've got parts of your country that are more temperate, that's the place where people have specialized in very high valued agriculture. It turns out those are also incredibly sensitive to warming. Because if it warms, they will lose that temperate climate. They'll be pushed into less productive, more tropical climate zones. They'll have less, their productivity is going to fall. If you're already in a tropical zone, though, you can't be growing those temperate crops. It turns out you have a whole host of other tropical crops you can grow. It turns out you're less sensitive. So that's just a result that we have found in some earlier studies. So this is an example. This is coming out of Latin America. So I have a couple of examples that are out of the region because this just happens to be places where we study stuff. So what we have here is sort of 5 types of farms. We have crops that are rain-fed. We have crops that are irrigated. We have what we're calling mixed, which means you're doing a mixture of crops and livestock. And then we have livestock only. And what this is showing is 3 different climate scenarios. So the blue one, the CCC blue one here is a relatively severe scenario, big climate change. The CCSR is a moderate climate change, and PCM is a very modest climate change scenario. So these are 3 different scenarios from 3 different climate models. And what this is showing you is, well, the adaptation people would do would depend on the climate scenario. That's one thing it's saying. And then what are they doing? Well, as the climate warms, it turns out people are moving away from crop-only agriculture. Both rain-fed and irrigated agriculture is going to decline. The more severe the scenario, the more it's going to decline. These mixed farmers, these small mixed farmers, they have hardly any effect. They're pretty robust. That's because they've got this mixture of activities. They actually can handle different climates within that mixture. Where do they go? If they move out of this, and this stays pretty much the same, they're going here. What this is showing is that across a lot of Latin America, as climate changes, they'll move out of doing crops and into doing more livestock. I don't know what the answer is here in Asia. That's part of what we're going to try to find out. So one of the questions you've got is, well, what happens here? How will this happen? That's something we have to find out. That's one of the reasons why it's valuable for us to study agriculture and adaptation in agriculture. Okay, so this is one question. What's going to happen to the basic type of farm? So what's another question? You're growing crops. Which crop? Which crop are you going to grow? One of the things that the agronomic research has shown is that different crops like to be in different climate zones. And once in a while you get a crop like maize that has many, many varieties, and so it's capable of being in lots of different climate zones. But most often crops like one particular place, and that's where they want to grow. What happens as climate changes? If that's growing in one particular place, the place where it's going to grow when climate changes is different. One of the things that's true in the ecosystem models is they predict all the ecosystems will move north. They'll move poleward. So it depends on whether you're north or south of the hemisphere. They're going to move poleward. That's exactly what has to happen to crops as well. As climate warms, crops ought to shift poleward. How smart do farmers have to be? They have to be as smart as trees. That's one way to say it. They can't be any dumber than trees. That's the assumption. That is, we're not actually imagining a very sophisticated thing. We're just saying, look, this crop grows well here, it gets warmer, it's not going to grow so well. Something that's just a little bit in a warmer zone than that is going to move in and take its place. That idea that crops are going to switch and that things are going to move into new zones is what crop switching is all about. This looks like, wow, that's really futuristic, but if it's done gradually, it will happen without anyone ever noticing. That is, there are places already where you can see crops have shifted into new zones. That is something that will happen slowly but surely as each farmer figures out what's best for itself. So that's one of the things that we have discovered is you've got these multiple crops. Each one wants to be in a particular place. As the climate changes, you'll switch to the best crop that you now want, that is in the new place. So this is an example of crops in Africa, and it's telling you, depending on the temperature in Africa, you end up seeing very different mixes of crops being grown. And what it's showing is, in particular, is that wheat and potatoes tend to like being in cold places. You don't think of Africa being a cold place particularly, but there are cold places in Africa, and that's what's grown there. And what happens to wheat and potatoes if temperatures grow? Well, their productivity drops dramatically as temperatures get warmer, and it turns out farmers know that, and they switch out of growing wheat and potatoes. What do they move into? At first, they'll move into maize. What happens later? When it gets much warmer, it turns out there's a whole bunch of other crops, soybeans, rice, squash, vegetables, that you can move into as the annual temperatures move into a warmer zone. And then finally, what do you got out here? You got the safety valve. As temperatures get really hot, as you move to the hottest parts of Africa that are still wet enough to grow crops, it turns out they move to fruits and some vegetables. So what this is showing is that already now you can see that farmers in different parts of Africa are doing different things depending on what their own climate's going to be, is now. What we're arguing is farmers are surely going to be smart enough to do the same thing in the future. We're not going to have future farmers be dumber than current ones. That they're going to at least be as smart as the current ones are, and they will also make this decision and figure out what's best for them given where they actually live. Same thing happens with precipitation. As precipitation changes, you also see a switch in which crops are grown in different places. So it turns out wheat likes to be here in this relatively dry area. As temperatures increase, you can move into some of these other crops. Whoops, did I get that right? Well, you can move into some of these other crops as the temperatures warm and they become more suitable for environment. So one of the things you also see is that precipitation is going to play a big role in which crop is grown. Now, one of the things I have not shown you is that another thing that tends to matter is the seasonal distribution of things. So this is just showing you sort of annual temperature, but it turns out that crops care about spring versus summer versus fall temperatures, and they will do different things depending on how each of those seasons change. So that's another complication, but I left that out of this because it gets very complicated very quickly. So one of the things that we expect is that crop choice is going to change with climate change. So how the crops are picked, they've optimized for the current climate, but the idea is if you've got a new climate, people make a different decision. And they'll make the decision that maximizes the net revenue on their lands. So what's true? Ultimately, the adaptations are local. Each farmer doesn't care about other parts of China. This is China we're studying in this particular case. They only care about what's happening in their district. And so they're going to figure out what's best for them in their district. It's a local decision. And every different district is going to make a different choice. So what am I showing you here? I'm showing you different regions. So these are 3 of the 5 regions of China. So this is not every region, but I'm trying to show you some examples of regions that had big changes. And again, I'm showing you 3 models. Actually, it's the mild, the moderate, and the more extreme. And we're going over 4 of the crops that are chosen. So there's other crops that are chosen that I'm not showing you just because the last thing you want to see is 12 crops and thousands of examples. So I'm just trying to give you a sense that climate change is going to make a big difference. And how is it going to make a big difference? Well, if we just follow through on PCM, which is this mild scenario, what this is saying is if you're in the Northeast, you're going to see people growing more wheat. That is, there's going to be a 10% increase in the prevalence of wheat in that region, the Northeast. But is that true everywhere? No. In the middle, it's almost going to stay the same. In the Northwest, it's also going to go up by 10% in that scenario. So wheat's going to go up. If wheat goes up, something else has got to go down. So in this particular scenario, we're showing sugar is going to go down. So we're going to grow less sugar in the Northeast if this happens. You can see that in the Northwest, it's not just that wheat goes up, there's also going to be a big increase in potatoes for some reason. And that's going to result in not just sugar going down, but also maize going down. So why am I showing you this? Sugarcane, yeah, sugarcane. So why am I showing you this? What I'm trying to show you is that the adjustments in different regions of China are different to the same scenario. It's the same climate model. Why are they different? Partly because each region is starting in a different place, that they all have different initial starting points. Sometimes the climate scenarios are slightly different by region. So that was one of the other things that you saw in the presentation this morning, that not all of Asia is going to face exactly the same story. It actually is going to be different in different parts of Asia. And so that's a reason why you're going to see different results in different areas. What's going on in the other 2 models? The other 2 models are making bigger changes. And so because there's bigger changes in the climate, you're seeing bigger adjustments being made by farmers. So you're seeing this gigantic increase in potatoes in the Hadley model. And what is that coming at the expense of? Sugar and maize in that region. You're also seeing the same thing happening in the other regions, but not necessarily to the same extent. So one of the things that's going on is in the different climate models, you're making different adjustments. So the adjustments, the adaptations, are climate specific. So one of the things this is saying is, you can't just say, well, it's climate change. That's one thing. You're going to make one adjustment. You've got to look at exactly what is the story. What is it you're trying to adjust to? What specific story is associated with that particular climate change? And as we start to think well into the future, there's a huge range of changes that might happen. These are all plausible scenarios. So this is one of the reasons why doing work too far in advance is troublesome, because you don't know what you're supposed to do too far in advance. Once this scenario, one of these scenarios actually turns out to be the truth, then there's one thing to do. So that's something else I'm trying to get across, that this is tied to the scenario. The actual change that we were predicting what is going to happen is tied to the scenario, and that it's different in different regions. So is it just crops? It turns out livestock is also sensitive to climate. Most of the research in agriculture has been focused on crops, but the research that we've done on livestock suggests it too is sensitive. So this isn't just a crop issue. So what are we finding? We're finding, whoops, I didn't mean to do that. We're finding high-value beef and cattle, dairy cattle. They like particular place. They like it to be cool. They like it to be dry. but we're finding surprising enough that sheep and goats don't mind things being hot and wet. So as climate changes, you would actually change your mix, how often you'd see particular animals versus others. So let's see what that looks like. So this is, again, a case from Africa, and it's talking about how the choice of particular livestock changes depending on the temperature. So we're seeing, again, in the parts of Africa that are relatively cool, we're seeing they tend to concentrate on beef cattle and dairy cattle, these two have high probability of occurring. But as climate warms, as you get to higher and higher temperatures, what you're seeing is actually there's a different mix of animals that you're seeing in warmer places. And if it gets really warm, then you see the sheep and the goats become very prevalent. So one of the things that's interesting about this is that if you talk about large changes in climate, you might actually see very large changes in the mix of animals that you'll see on the landscape. And again, this is also somewhat sensitive to precipitation. A little less sensitive than it is to temperature, but still sensitive. And what you're seeing again is that relatively dry areas, you get beef cattle and dairy. They tend to like being in the drier places. As it gets wetter, you're getting more goats and sheep and to a certain extent chickens. So again, it's sensitive to that as well, precipitation as well. So what else is going on? The decision about when to plant and when to harvest. We have indications that this too is sensitive to temperatures, partly because most people they're planting, how early they plant is constrained by cold. So as the temperature is warm, the idea is you can plant earlier. As if you're constrained on the other end by again frost, then it means you can have a longer season. In general, in agriculture, there's a belief that a longer season means more productivity. So this is another subtle adjustment. This isn't something where you're spending money. You're just changing when you grow a crop. So what it means is you can sometimes switch to having double cropping. Sometimes you can switch to more productive varieties that take longer to grow. So they give you advantages. Warming gives you an advantage because it increases your growing season. But warming also has a disadvantage. And the disadvantage is that as you warm, summer peaks become more exaggerated. And summer peaks tend to be damaging. So that's a constraint. So again, that's why the seasonal distribution of all this stuff also turns out to be important. Not just the annual temperature, but how it's distributed across the seasons. So this is more of a hypothetical thing than an empirical thing, but it's just trying to give you a sense that what would happen as the temperatures warm. The idea is that when you plant, can get earlier and earlier. You can start to plant sooner and sooner in the year. And what's going to happen to the growing season? Basically, as the temperatures warm, you get a longer growing season. That's generally beneficial to have that. So one of the things that's going on is warming isn't just outright bad. It can have some beneficial sides to it. Where is it the worst? It's worst in the peak periods, which is the summer. Inputs. These are variable inputs, things like fertilizer, irrigation, capital. Economic theory generally says you put more inputs in more productive land. That is, there's an interaction between productive land and what the additional benefit you get by adding inputs. That's a general phenomenon in terms of when we fitted production functions, it turns out that these things complement each other. More productive land gives you a bigger punch. So sometimes agronomists are a little confused by that. They say, wow, there's lots of inputs, this guy's got lots of outputs, so why don't we force the person that has very little inputs to use a lot more, because then they'll get a lot of outputs too. It won't work that way. The fact that some farmers put a lot more input into their land is endogenous. It's because they have better land. And if you try to put lots of inputs on lousy land, you get very little back. So it turns out that is terribly important with climate, because it's one of the adjustments farmers will make. So some of the early crop modelers thought that one way we could adjust for having lower yields from a hotter environment is just put more inputs in. That makes sense if all you're thinking about is how do I get my yields back to what they were. But if what you're trying to do is maximize net revenue, that is actually not good advice. As the land becomes less productive, you actually do not want to put more inputs on that land. You want to put less, actually. So one of the things that this is telling you is that depending on how whether the productivity goes up or down, farmers are going to change their input things. Now, what is the relationship between climate and productivity? It turns out, from an agriculture perspective, it's hill-shaped. That is, there is an optimal temperature that yields the highest productivity. And that turns out to be a temperate environment. So it's somewhere around 10, 12 degrees annual temperature. It's the place where the productivity tends to be the highest. As you get cooler than that, or you get warmer than that, productivity falls. So when you do warming, what happens to you? If it turns out you're on the cool side of the optimum, you actually increase your productivity. So if you are a high alpine country, if you're in high mountainous country, you're at high altitude, and you have a cold environment, you're Mongolia or something, and temperature's warm, it turns out you're going to be climbing the productivity hill. This is actually going to lead to more productive land. But if you're on the other side of that hill, and you're already struggling with the fact that it's too hot, you're going to go down the hill. It's going to be strictly a bad thing. So how climate change affects the agriculture sector depends on where you are on that absolute temperature hill. So that's one of the reasons why we're not seeing the same impacts in every place. One of the things that this is saying is that if your land is getting more productive, one of the adaptations you should make is to put more inputs on that land, because you're now going to get a bigger punch for that. But if your land's getting less productive, you want to do just the opposite. You want to put less inputs. You want to actually withdraw inputs from the land. So this is another way, another input into the whole process. So this is trying to give you a sense, a rough curve of that. It turns out that that curve, that hill-shaped curve, is different for every crop. So what else is going on? Another adaptation that's going on is markets themselves make adaptations. So how do markets make adaptations? Trade turns out to be one of the reasons why the agriculture sector today in modern society is much more robust than it was in older times. I'm calling it older times. What does that mean? It means periods when moving crops around the planet was very expensive. In those days, the amount of food you had depended on how much you could grow, because you could not trade crops very easily. China was not trading with the Middle East in year zero. It wasn't possible to move crops that far. And so whether China starved or not depended on what China itself grew. So one of the things that's going on in the world today, the modern world, the world in the last 150 years or so, is that we can move crops around the world cheaply. Why is that important? It means that you no longer depend on your local environment as to whether you starve to death or not. The concept of food security, which every country's got, was very relevant 200 or 300 years ago. Is it relevant today? No. No. Today, there's plenty of food in the globe. That's not the problem. How do we know that? How do economists measure food, the value of things? By their price. What's happened to the value of food over the last century, over the 20th century? We've had this dramatic increase in the number of people here. They're all hungry. They want to eat lots. What's happened to the price of food? It has fallen in the 20th century. So food is actually abundant right now. It's not food that's scarce. It's allocation of food to every individual that is not so perfect. Some people don't have adequate access to food. It's not because there's not enough food grown. It's mostly because they don't have income or war. There's some reason why they're not getting access to food. But it's not because there's not enough supply. So why is that? This is one of the beauties of the trade. One of the beauties of trade is that you have a bad weather year, you can buy more food. You are not starving to death. That's not going to happen anymore. It didn't happen. It doesn't happen anymore. That's a thing of the past. That's one of the things that's very important. For climate change, that's extremely important. Because if you want rice and your country isn't very good at growing rice in the future because it's too warm, you can still buy rice from some other place that can grow it well. You're not going to starve to death. That is not part of the story. The only way you're going to starve to death in the global thing is if global production for some reason falls. But we're not actually predicting global production is going to fall, even on some of the most severe scenarios, unless climate change is a great deal. That you need 5 degrees, 6 degrees, then we might have some problems with global food security. But 3, 4 degrees, it's not likely that's going to be a problem. So why is that? It's because the question is how much can the globe grow? And the globe can grow plenty of food in the future. We can adapt. Agriculture is going to adapt. It can adapt. And trade turns out to be fundamental to that. So if some of you guys say, well, I don't like trade so much, I don't like this globalization stuff, forget about it. That's critical to adapting to climate. It's going to be critical to adapting to the future, not just to climate. This is not just a climate question. This is a much bigger question. So trade turns out to be a big adaptation structure. What's going on? Weather events. You've had some weather events. You had some pretty severe weathers in the last few years. Did people in Asia starve to death? No, they did not. Why? Because they changed their trade patterns and imported food in bad years. Okay. What's happening lately? Very recently, we have seen global food prices go up. Is that from bad weather? Is that from climate change? It might be, but if it's from climate change, it's from mitigation, not from
flood.
Okay.
So we had international market,
did actually inch up a little. That may be true if you couldn't trade. That's the point I'm trying to make. It's not that, wow, there's no possible story that's bad for global crops. That's going too far. The crop prices wiggle around. But your local prices would have gone up dramatically if you completely depended on your own supply. So trade turns out to be an adaptation. Not from an individual farmer's perspective, but from a consumer's perspective. Trade softened the blow that otherwise you would have had. So this is actually a map of global prices. This is kind of the story I was trying to tell, that the global prices for the longest time have been falling, but actually just recently we've got this thing happening. Somewhere in there was that spike you were talking about that did affect at least some crop prices, but you can see that doesn't explain this whole thing. That this general upward trend that we're seeing now, there's two possible explanations for it. One is the energy is more expensive, and that's an important input into crops. And the second is that we're now diverting substantial amount of land out of crops into other things. So the final thing I want to talk about. So we talked about farmers adapting. We've talked about the market doing some adaptation just as a market. So what else is there? Is there a role for government in any of this? And there are some roles for government. One of the things that governments can do is they can do research and development. So you can develop new varieties, new breeds that actually can survive a warmer or drier climate. In practice, we've been better at adapting to drier climates than we have to warmer climates. There are actually very few examples of crops, new varieties that have been developed to handle warmer settings, and they haven't actually been developed for climate change. The one obvious case is there are new soybeans that have been developed that can handle a warmer environment. Why were they created? Brazil created them. Why? Because they wanted to use a whole vast part of Brazil that's pretty hot, too hot for the existing varieties. By developing these new varieties, they could take over the Mato Grosso area of Brazil, develop it, and turn it into these gigantic farms. So they did it for economic development. But what is that? That is actually a warming adaptation. That ability, the fact that we now have a variety of soybeans that can grow in a warmer place means that anybody else in the future who's facing a warmer temperature could pick up these new soybeans and grow there. Why isn't this happening everywhere? Why aren't we getting a lot more new R&D for crops? It's turning out to be harder than people thought. The Green Revolution, you are certainly aware of the Green Revolution. It had a gigantic impact in Asia about your productivity here. But it's turning out that doing that same thing of making those crops more productive in more settings is turning out to be harder for the agronomic guys, for the breeders. Apparently, in order to survive in a warmer setting, you have to change lots of things simultaneously. And it's very difficult. So we haven't made much progress. But that's certainly something that we want to make progress. And investing money in growing crops, in learning to grow crops in warmer settings, is definitely something that you want governments to do. And that's not just individual governments. This actually is something you want CJRs to do. You want international agencies to do. Because once you develop these new crops, everybody can use them. So you sort of want an international effort in that. What else can you do? You can do new farm management techniques. The Green Revolution is often sold by crop agronomists as simply new hybrids that we came up with, new types of varieties, and that's all it was. But apparently, more than half of the productivity increase is improved management. Better management, more inputs. That's what actually caused the Green Revolution. It caused a huge chunk of it. So part of what we want to think about is how should we change our managements? So again, that's got to do with inputs. How do we adjust inputs to get the most out of the land we've got? What else can we do? It turns out irrigation is another answer. Rain-fed farms are very sensitive to climate. If climate shifts just a little bit, you've got to do something completely different on a rain-fed farm. Irrigated farms are much more robust. The climate can change quite a lot, over a lot larger range, and they can still keep doing what they're doing. So one of the things that does make a more resilient agriculture sector is irrigation. And one of the things that makes Asia actually probably, well, this is one of the things I want to find out. It certainly looks like it in China, but one of the things I'd like to see is true in Asia in general. One of the things that's on Asia's side is that a large fraction of Asian agriculture is irrigated. And that actually might make it more robust. What else? We've got 5 more minutes. Okay. Strengthen private responsibilities on farmland. Some farmers are on common property. They're not quite sure how long they can farm. They underinvest in protecting the soils. They don't put the same investments in that people that have long-term responsibilities have. So one idea is you can actually give them the land and make it private, but you can also do things that are in between. Lengthen the amount of period you lease land to farmers, give them more responsibilities, somehow let them make more investments and reap the rewards of making more investments into the land. So this is important for agriculture. Another thing that we talked about a little bit is weather insurance. You know, one of the things that people are very concerned about is weather goes up and down. If farmers are relatively poor, they might be very vulnerable to these fluctuations, and the idea is insurance can help with that. So this is the concern about common property. One of the things we're concerned about in common property is we see an underinvestment in the natural resource. So in grasslands and stuff, we're seeing too much livestock, which is the private resource, too little investment in protecting the grassland itself. So the grassland's the shared resource. The idea is that there's a concern that way too many animals are on that same land. Same thing's happening in forests. The concern is that common property lands are not optimally managed. So what can you do? You can try to give a little bit more responsibility to private entities. You can try to get communities to have stable control over their own land, or you can go all the way to private ownership. But you only want to do this on lands which are suitable for private property, for development, for agriculture. And then weather insurance is another thing. One of the things that's really attractive about competitive weather insurance is that the companies will charge premiums equal to the expected damages, right? Because the company's got to break even. Otherwise, they're out of business. It turns out the premiums then become a signal to people as to whether they should farm that particular piece of land. So that turns out to work very well. What happens when governments subsidize this, though? When governments subsidize this, then the premium message gets lost because now it's cheap to grow crops on lousy land, on risky land. And so in the United States, one of the things that we see is with our subsidized crop insurance program, farmers are doing a lot of development in areas where crops have a huge amount of weather variation, places that they would have otherwise avoided. And so by subsidizing weather insurance, we actually see this undesired outcome that a lot more American agriculture is now on more risky land that farmers would have otherwise avoided. So weather insurance is a good idea. Subsidizing insurance is a bad idea from an adaptation point of view. So that's important to get the distinction between that. Insurance is good, but if you subsidize it, you're taking away some of the incentive for people to adapt. And that's not good. It leads to maladaptation. And then finally, for those of you who are economists, there's now a journal for you. That's a plug-in. That's just an advertisement. There's now a Journal of Climate Change Economics.